Thank you, Modesto, and good afternoon, everyone. This is a public hearing on the Committee of Public Safety regarding Bill number 200412. Before I begin, I'd like to, for the record, note that Bill number 200479 will be held today and will be heard at the public hearing, public safety hearing scheduled for November 23rd. And now I'd like to recognize Ms. Samantha Williams, Esquire, for a required notice and announcement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand that state law currently requires that the following announcement be made at the beginning of every remote public hearing as follows. Due to the current public health emergency, City Council committees are currently meeting remotely. We are using Microsoft Teams to make these remote hearings possible. Instructions for how the public may view and offer public testimony at public hearings of council committees are included in the public hearing notices that are published in the Daily News, Inquirer, and Legal Intelligencer prior to the hearings and can also be found on phlcouncil.com. Everyone who has been invited to the meeting to testify should be aware that this public hearing is being recorded. Because the hearing is public, participants and viewers have no reasonable expectation of privacy. By continuing to be in the meeting, you are consenting to being recorded. Additionally, prior to Councilman Jones recognizing members for questions or comments they have for a witness, I will note for the record at this time that we will use the chat feature available in Microsoft Teams to allow members to signify that they wish to be recognized. In order to comply with the Sunshine Act, the chat features must only be used for this purpose. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. And would we now like to take the roll to make sure we have a quorum and members when you are called upon, recognize that you're present and say a few words so that we can capture your image.
Councilmember Thomas.
Present. Did you hear me?
Yes. Thank you.
Councilmember Green. Councilmember Green. Councilmember Gautier.
Present. Happy to be here for this discussion.
Councilmember Ginn.
Present.
Councilmember Brooks.
Station.
Present.
Providing PPE and de-escalation.
Vice Chairman Johnson. Chairman Jones.
Present.
We are also joined by Majority Leader Sherelle Parker today.
Present.
All right. Thank you. I note for the record that a quorum has been established. This meeting is now called to order. Ms. Williams, will you please read the title of today's bill?
Bill number 200412, an ordinance amending Chapter 10, 2200 of the Philadelphia Code entitled Hate Crimes to provide for penalties for criminal conduct involving misuse of the 911 emergency response system motivated by hatred towards the character of other persons, all under certain terms and conditions.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. And at this time, I'd like to recognize the sponsor of this legislation to give some opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, on the first day that council was back in session this September, I introduced bill number 200412. The bill is not a complicated bill. All it does is clarify that it is a hate crime, complete with penalties for criminal conduct, to misuse the 911 emergency response system if one is motivated by a hatred towards certain characteristics of other persons, such as race or ethnicity. To be clear, it is already a crime to make a false 911 call, such as a fake or prank 911 call. But this bill clarifies that it's a hate crime if you falsely call 911 on someone because of their race or ethnicity. As many of you probably already know, this legislation was inspired by a May 25th, 2020 Central Park bird watching incident, where a white woman walking her dog called 911 on a black bird watcher after the bird watcher asked her to leash her dog as per the rules. Before the woman called 911, interesting, she said, "I'm calling the cops. I'm going to tell them that there's an African-American man threatening my life." Obviously, this was deeply wrong and it should have never happened. Furthermore, what these past few months have shown with a tragic clarity for all of us is that sometimes when someone calls the police for help, it can tragically end up and result in a loss of life. 911 should be used only during true emergencies and certainly not used as a weapon under false pretenses, against a person because of their race or ethnicity. I also want to just close my opening comments by giving my friends at the 911 call center a shout out. Right before COVID shut everything down on March the 11th, we had a hearing, and Councilman and Chairman Jones, we had the resolution that we introduced together, the hearing regarding the hiring, staffing, and retention challenges for the 911 Unified Call Center and the impact that these challenges were having on the health and well-being of the 911 dispatchers. And during that hearing, we heard directly from 911 dispatchers, most of whom were Black women, women of color, and working mothers, and about the difficulties associated with their job and the pressure the job has on their personal lives, and family. I have them in mind today because they received the calls. They should never have to deal with answering a 911 call that is not only being made under false pretenses, but that it's essentially being used or trying to weaponize someone's race against them. Their job is already stressful enough. It pains me to think that they have to deal with calls, like this sometimes. And with that said, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I look forward to today's testimony and want to thank those who are testifying, particularly Michael Cord. He, along with a few, 3 of them in particular, attorneys. There is nothing that we are ever going to be doing or introducing that impacts the law that we are not going to send to Michael Cord and the 2 other attorneys to ask them to give us a cursory review of what we're proposing. And for that, I want to publicly say thank you to you, Michael Cord, on the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, you're on mute.
For the record, Modesto can mute you from afar. And so sometimes I think he does that just to make me look like the old man on mute. But thank you, Madam Leader, for your leadership in this regard. I do remember our tour of the 911 Center and how real it got when we listened to a lot of the operators who on a daily basis catch people at their worst moment. Literally. And to have to determine all kinds of factors out of a call, one of them should not be racially motivated calls designed to be discriminatory. So thank you for your leadership on that. Ms. Williams, can you please read the panel of the first group to testify on bill number 200412?
Sure. The first and only panel will be Francis Bailey and Michael.
Is he there?
I am here. I'm here, sir.
Always good to hear from you. You know the drill. Please state your name for the record and begin your testimony.
Well, let me start out by saying that the chairman is correct. Somebody muted my mic, but I'm ready to go. First of all, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the majority leader and all the members of City Council for allowing me to speak for about 7 or 8 minutes. And I'll make sure that I have my timer on so I don't go beyond that. I'm going to speak not only as an attorney, but as a historian. You know, I'm so pleased that Majority Leader Sherelle Parker has proposed this, because if some city council person had proposed this in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, there would have been no Black Wall Street destruction. Why? Because a white woman called in an emergency call about a Black man who had merely stumbled past a white woman in an elevator. So he's in a department store. He's trying to get into the elevator. He stumbles. He bumps into the white female elevator operator. A department store clerk sees it and calls the police, and the rest is history. Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921. And let me call out some names. We're talking about a Black man, 19-year-old gentleman, Dick Rowland. A 17-year-old elevator operator, Sarah Page. And in all fairness to her, the 17-year-old white female elevator operator, she told the police when they arrived that the guy didn't do anything to me. But the white woman in the department store who saw him stumble and called the police, and the rest, as they say, is history. 35 square blocks destroyed, incinerated, and about 200 Black men, women, and children murdered. In fact, historians say that that's the single worst racist attack in U.S. history. Had there been something in the mind of that white female department store clerk, knowing that making a fictitious call about something that didn't happen that's race-based, who knows? Maybe we wouldn't have the destruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. That's in 1921. Fast forward to 1931 with the Scottsboro Boys. Again, you have white folks, 2 white females, making up a story about Black men. In fact, really Black boys, because it's 9 of them aged 13 to 19 and 7 of them facing the death penalty. So there's a real need for some law, some ordinance, something to make people think twice before they pick up the phone and weaponize the police. Having said that, we're talking about telephonic hate crimes, but from my standpoint, it's not just a matter of protecting Black people by supporting this proposal, by passing this legislation. It's about protecting Black people by not weaponizing the police. And it's also about protecting city resources by not victimizing the public. Because if police officers have to run into Starbucks because some Black guy didn't have correct change, and then there's somebody getting their head bashed in at another location, well, the resources have been diverted, and now the real victims are not protected. So I don't want people to think that this proposed law is exclusively about helping Black folks. It is about that, but it's also making sure that police resources are used where necessary. You know, I read an article by a guy by the name of Michael Harriot. He writes for The Root, and he calls this not white collar crime, but white collar crime. And I think that's the perfect phrase there, white collar crime, because you have white folks committing crimes by picking up the phone and calling the police on somebody not engaging in criminal conduct. And I don't want anybody to think that this proposal is an outlier type proposal, that it's anti-cop, that it's one of those bad things that happen only in Philly. No, this has been talked about and in some cases passed in states like New York or California, or in cities like Grand Rapids, Michigan, or LA or San Francisco. In fact, San Francisco calls it the Karen Act. Karen spelled with a C. Caution against racially exploitive non-emergencies. And that's the perfect term. I'm looking at the clock to make sure I don't go over my allotted time. And one of the things I also want to add before I go any further is that when I look at these instances of people calling the police on nonviolent behavior by Black people, initially I called it breathing while Black. And then as I began to investigate, it's worse than breathing while Black. It's just being while Black. Why? Because white folks have called the cops on Black folks at funerals. At funerals. Now, who does that? So we have white folks calling the police on Black folks at funerals, trying to deal with coupons at supermarkets, sleeping in college, sleeping in the library, mowing the lawn, swimming, playing basketball, playing golf, at the gym, walking the dog, selling water on a street corner, being at Starbucks, being at Waffle House. And we can't forget what happened in 2009 to Harvard professor Dr. Skip Gates, going into your own home. So I really think the most important thing I want to make clear here is that this is not something that's an extreme proposal. It's happened other places and it needs to happen here. And those who say, well, Mike, you're overreacting. We're in the 21st century. We're in a post-racial society. It's not that bad. And I say, okay, let me ask you this question. If tomorrow you were driving down the street and lights and sirens from a police car came on behind you, and as that cop approached you, you could be a white driver or a Black driver, which would you choose? Well, the answer to that question is obvious. Why would everybody in America in the 21st century choose to be a white driver when the police approach them? That speaks volumes. And those people who call the cops on Black people know this. They know what happens. They know there's not a de-escalation. There is an escalation. And that's the problem. Now, I want to be clear. I have problems with bad cops, just like I got problems with bad lawyers, bad car salesmen, bad doctors, bad anything. But there's only one group that has a license to kill. And if we are monitoring misbehavior, yeah, look at the bad lawyers. Look at the bad doctors. Look at the bad used car salesmen. But when they're bad, do you get a bullet in the head? And I'm not just talking about the quote unquote thugs who are out there. I'm talking about Brianna and George and Philando and Eric and Michael. And that could be me and people who look like me. And again, it's not about bashing the police. It's about bashing conduct that could result in death. And again, not all cops are bad. There's some great heroic cops out there. But when you look at, for example, the KKK endorsing someone for president in 2016 and in 2020, and who's in bed with the KKK endorsing that same person? It's the FOP. And this is the same group. These are the same groups that heard this person they endorse in public at a press conference encourage the police to, quote, not be too gentle with suspects. When we go into the history of policing, and again, I want to underscore the fact that I'm not bashing all cops. I'm bashing conduct that could result in innocent people being murdered. And again, as I said, when you get to situations where the police are called on Black people, especially on Black men, it's never de-escalated. It's always escalated. And putting on, once again, my historian hat, when we go back to, well, where did the police department start? How did they come about? History books tell us 1704 in the colony of Carolina. It was the slave patrols where age 21-year-old and older white men were deputized to monitor past requirements of enslaved people, to break up Black gatherings, to randomly search slave quarters, to inflict impromptu punishments. That's in 1704. That's the colony of Carolina. And from that, we have municipal police departments. And again, I'm talking about the bad apples. But the bad apples, if they can result in somebody dying, are worse than just bad apples. And speaking of history, and I had to double check, triple check, quadruple check this, but it turns out to be correct. Since 2015 in America, Police have killed, on average, more unarmed black people than the number of black people who were lynched between 1882 and 1892. Let me repeat that. Since 2015, more unarmed black people, on average, have been killed by police at 2 a week than were lynched by racist mobs between 1882 and 1892. Now, with cops, it's 2 a week. Back then, during lynching, it was 1.25. That's frightening. And I'm not saying that every white person who calls the police on innocent black people knows that statistic, but they have an idea about it. So in closing, let me just say this. I applaud the majority leader, Sherelle Parker, for this proposal. It's not an outlier. It's consistent with New York State, with California State, with Grand Rapids, Michigan, with LA, with San Francisco. And as a criminal defense attorney, I know it's consistent with the laws we already have on the books. We have a law under Section 2710, ethnic intimidation, that deals with people who commit violent crimes, but they're motivated by malicious intent. You take that Section 2710, ethnic intimidation, and you combine it with Section 4906, false reports to police officers or law enforcement, you have what the councilwoman is trying to do here. And again, to show that this is not an outlier, we got Section 4905, false alarms to agencies of public safety. We have unsworn falsification to authorities. We have false swearing. All we're trying to do, or I hope all Philadelphians help City Council to do, is to make sure that, one, we protect black folks by making sure police are not weaponized, and two, that we don't waste resources by taking away the police from the good work that most of them do. Thank you very much for your time, and I think I was about 37 seconds over.
Well, I want to thank you for the lesson. I always enjoy your testimony for that reason. I am harking back to, I did the tour of the African American Museum, and in the section where Emmett Till was, and I think about how historically that there was no law for a whistle at any interracial person. That was not a felony punishable by death, but in the case of similar kinds of calls to police or authority, it became a death sentence. And when you talk about overreaction, there is a thing called implicit bias. So when you arrive at a scene, you draw conclusions on what you see. It harkens to my father was a frequent shopper at the Reading terminal. He had a particular meat shop that he would patronize. He bought his selection of cuts that he really liked. He put the bag down next to him. A white gentleman came up, looked, picked the bag up, and started walking away faster. So my father is chasing him. And somebody saw my father chasing this white gentleman. They called security. The assumption was that my father was approaching and attacking him, and the gentleman that was stealing my father's bag played into it. Fortunately, they went back to the place where the meat was purchased and said, no, he's the customer, that's the attempted thief. And so implicit bias as a reaction of phone calls where people draw conclusions based on race is very dangerous, as you cited, because it can escalate beyond its original scope and intent and become a catastrophe waiting to happen. Are there any members, Ms. Williams, of the committee would like to ask questions at this time?
Mr. Chairman, if it's possible, Mr. Chairman, can we have Mr. Healy to testify, because we know that he has something else scheduled, and thank you for staying on to testify, Mr. Healy. We greatly appreciate it.
Mr. Healy, please.
Sure.
Name,
Good
record, and begin
Sure.
your testimony.
afternoon, Chairman Jones and other members of the Committee on Public Safety. My name is Francis Healy, and I'm the Special Advisor to Commissioner Outlaw. On behalf of the Commissioner, thank you for allowing the Philadelphia Police Department an opportunity to voice its opinion on Bill number 200412. Clearly, this legislation was prompted by the events this past summer that transpired in New York City when an individual made false reports to 911. The lead prosecutor in that case said it best: on using the police in a way that is both racially offensive and designed to intimidate is something that can't be ignored. The Philadelphia Police Department completely agrees with this statement and appreciates that this body has also not ignored the issue. As such, the Philadelphia Police Department supports this bill. As you know, the department is reforming daily. Efforts are already underway to provide responding officers the most available information for dealing with people in crisis-related calls. The intentional misuse of the 911 system based upon hate, which prompts officers to respond, is not only offensive, but endangers their lives and undermines the trust between the police and the communities we serve. So any efforts to address this issue is greatly appreciated. So the Philadelphia Police Department fully supports this measure, and we'll do anything we can to support it. That's the end of my testimony.
Thank you.
Short and sweet.
Are there? Yeah, it was. You're a professional. Ms. Williams, is there anyone else on this panel?
No, this is not witnesses.
Are there any questions from members of this committee? Ms. Williams?
There are no questions indicated in the chat.
I see your name, Member Green.
Yes, thank you, Councilmember Jones. Thank you, Councilmember Majority Leader Parker, for this legislation. This legislation is something that I think is important, especially for people of color, and in particular, African-American men. A good friend of mine, Shaman Walton, who's a supervisor in San Francisco, introduced similar legislation in San Francisco. And he informed me that Assemblyman Rob Bunta also introduced similar legislation at the state level. And I'm curious from either Mr. Healy or from Mr. Cord, if based on the legislation that mirrors this legislation, have there been any convictions or fines that you've heard where people have been penalized for doing these type of activities based on this type of legislation?
I'll defer to Mr. Healy.
I'm honestly not personally aware. We actually investigate crank calls and a lot of the other, and that gets lumped into the issues in police radio, but we actively investigate misuse of 911 systems and do take the appropriate action when appropriate. We have a detective assigned to police radio for that very function.
And if I can just follow up briefly, I'm a member of a group called the Pennsylvania Association of Criminal Defense Attorneys, and we are part of a national association, and we have not yet heard of any prosecution. And I probably shouldn't admit this, but I certainly will. As defense attorneys, we look at what was proposed, for example, in San Francisco. We say, that's so tight, we'd have problems defending people, because we always look for gaps in the law. But in looking at, for example, Pennsylvania's ethnic intimidation law and looking at Pennsylvania's false alarm law, if you cover the basis of both of those laws into the new 911, then defense attorneys are going to have a rough time defending against those. So we have not yet heard of any prosecutions. We know they're coming. And if they're as tight as San Francisco, there'll be convictions.
Thank you, Mr. Cord. And I just think this is important legislation, as both Majority Leader Parker and Councilmember Jones stated earlier. We put a lot of pressure on our police dispatchers to do the best job they can do, especially with all the challenges we have in our city. And we all are very familiar with the tragic death of Walter Wallace Jr. But we should not be enabling people to use their own implicit bias, to use the public sector in a way that discriminates against others. And this country has a long history of that. Mr. Cord provided a lot of great background historical context. I'm glad we are in this edition of the radio courtroom in City Council on a Tuesday afternoon. But it's so important that we have this type of legislation and send a message that we're not going to tolerate these type of biased perspective, and we're not going to use public resources to impact racist acts on American citizens. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Member Green. Are there any other members of the committee that wish to question this panel? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony. And are there any others to testify on this bill?
No, there are not.
So, seeing none, this will conclude our public hearing, and we will go into our public meeting. Thank you, witnesses, and we'll allow you to disconnect at this time so that we can go into our public meeting to be able to move this bill. The committee will now go into its public meeting to consider action on the proposed bill. Today, can you, Ms. Williams, read once again the attendance so that we can take roll to make sure we still have a quorum?
Sure. Councilmember Thomas?
Present.
Councilmember Green? Can everyone mute their microphones? Because I don't think people can hear me. There's a lot of feedback. Is that better? Can you hear me now? Okay. Councilmember Green?
Present.
Councilmember Gautier?
Present.
Councilmember Gim?
Present.
Councilmember Brooks?
Present.
And Chairman Jones?
Present. I had to remove this, so there's a mechanical aspect of it. So I see that we have a quorum. The chair now recognizes Councilman Green for a motion on bill number 200412.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a point of information. I believe Councilmember Thomas is also present.
Duly noted. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that bill number 200412 be reported from this committee with a favorable recommendation, and further move that the rules of council be suspended to permit first reading of this bill at the next session of council.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. It has been moved and properly seconded that bill number 200412 has been reported from this committee. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 All those opposed? The ayes have it. It has been moved and properly seconded that bill number 200412 has been reported from this committee with a favorable recommendation, and further move that the rules of council be suspended to allow the first reading of this bill at our next session of council. This concludes our business for today, and thank you so very much for your testimony, and congratulations, Madam Majority Leader. Do you have something to say in conclusion? Is that it? All right. This concludes the business of the Committee on Public Safety. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.